Welcome to the Futurati podcast. Any member of the Futurati is somebody who believes in the power of the future. We know there's a better world ahead, and we indeed have the power to make it so. In our podcast, we talk to the best minds in the world about the most urgent problems facing mankind today, and we hope you learn as much from them as we do. I'm Thomas Fry, a professional futurist and keynote speaker.
And I'm Trent Fowler, a machine learning engineer and author. Thank you for joining us. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for listening to the Futurati podcast. Tonight, we're joined by Peter Langland-Hassan. Dr. Langland-Hassan is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Cincinnati and working groups lead for the Institute for Research in Sensing at the University of Cincinnati. He is author of the book Explaining Imagination, published in 2020 by Oxford University Press, and co-editor of the anthology Inner Speech, New Voices, also published with Oxford. His numerous published articles span theoretical philosophy and experimental psychology, addressing topics such as consciousness, auditory, verbal hallucinations, the relationship between language and abstract thought, pretense, imagination, hypothetical reasoning, and creativity. If you enjoyed this interview, please don't forget to like the episode and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so that we can keep bringing you this great content. Peter, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Why don't we hear a little bit about your background and your interests and what brought you to working on the problems that you're working on today?
Okay, well, I'm a philosophy professor at the University of Cincinnati, and I work in the philosophy of mind and also in experimental psychology. So, I've been working on those topics for a long time. In fact, my dissertation coming out of grad school was on imagination. I was initially drawn to that topic because I was interested in the mind-body problem in philosophy, or the question of consciousness and its relation to physical things in the world, and why it might seem that consciousness couldn't be a physical thing. And I was, taken with that puzzle, and that sort of led me into philosophy. And then I became convinced that somehow the appearance of that puzzle was due to the way that we think about minds, and specifically the way we imagine minds. And so I got to thinking hard about what imagination is, how it works, how it represents things, how it represents both mental things and things in the world. And that led me onto this further path about just, getting down to analyzing the nature of imagination itself. And that sort of led up to finally last year, I published my book on imagination called Explaining Imagination, where I give my grand theory, what I call a kind of reductive theory. I can give more details on that later if we want, of imagination. And along the way, I've worked on other things, inner speech, so the voice in the head, when we talk to ourselves silently. What is, why do we do that? Why do we go in for so much inner speech? For those of us that do, what would, if we were to lose that ability to generate speech in the head, how would that affect our other kinds of cognitive abilities? Are there any unobvious ways? Obviously, we'd have difficulty generating and planning what we want to say in the head, but would we have more general reasoning difficulties or not? And that gets to the general question about the relationship between language and thinking. And so I've investigated those questions both sort of in philosophical work and in some experimental work.
Fantastic. I actually have questions related to every single one of those things. So that's an excellent opener.
Okay, great.
Real quick, I've been doing quite a bit of work on the future of work and this idea of what things can be automated out of existence and what things can't. Do you have any general rules of thumb as to what things can AI do that what things can people do that AI will never be able to do?
I mean, that's a question that I find really interesting. I've thought about. I don't have any line in the sand about that. I continue to be amazed about what AI can do. And we can talk about this. One of the things I talk about in the book is creativity, and certain kinds of creativity that seem to me to present some of the hardest cases for AI. Writing a truly great song, right, or a great novel, Those seem like difficult things to do, but I try to approach those in a way, and I can talk about why and whether we're right to think that they're difficult. I mean, we could talk about that. But I think it's interesting to think about, well, those kinds of examples in mind, what would be the real barriers for that? And do we see the seeds of an ability to do that in current AI? I actually think we do. And I don't know if that's something to kind of get deeper into right now, or this topic of creativity in AI. That's where I'm inclined to go when you ask that question about limits.
Yeah. I think in terms of our imagination and the ability to come up with something that's a totally unique and new product for the marketplace,
right?
Something that didn't exist before you came up with the idea. That seems like that would be an impossibility for AI to come up with something like that.
Yeah. Well, let me give you my longer answer to this then, if that's all right.
Sure.
So let's think about certain cases of creativity. Start with cases where it seems like an AI perhaps could do something creative. Think about a case. So it's a common task for kids to do in sort of science class in elementary school. You're given a set of materials. You say, okay, out of this tape and these pieces of paper and paper clips, I want you to make the tallest freestanding structure that you can. Okay. And then the classmates break into groups and they see who can win this challenge. Now, there's some creativity involved here, right? Hopefully they've never, seen other people do this particular challenge. They have to think about new ways to combine these materials. Okay. I think, it'd be strange to deny that that's a creative thing to do. But on the other hand, we can see it as a complex bit of reasoning from knowing the properties of the various things, calculating ways they could be combined, right? And finally arriving at a suitable sort of solution. And we could even imagine writing an algorithm for, given these materials, right, that would take us to a sort of a good way of arranging them for a tall structure. I don't think people would necessarily question the ability of AI to do that. And the interesting thing there, I think, is that as soon as we feel like we could describe how to do something roughly in an algorithmic way, we decide, well, it's not really creativity if you do that. Right. It's the kids, okay, before we thought about it a lot, we said, oh, that was a very creative solution to this problem. But once we break it down and we formalize the algorithm, okay, well, the machine does it, they follow the algorithm, that's not creative. Now, I think the machine deserves to be called creative in that case. However, it doesn't get to the real challenge because we might feel like, fair enough, that's not the kind of groundbreaking discovery that we really had in mind that would be beyond the reach of AI. So what then? Okay, then let's get a little more precise about what we mean. What is this kind of creativity? And a term has been called in the literature on creativity is sometimes this term transformative creativity is used to mark a kind of creativity that introduces some kind of truly new idea into the world that can't just be seen as reshuffling or reorganizing past ideas. I think Margaret Bowden is a psychologist who popularized that term. So when I think of transformative creativity, you can think of all kinds of examples, but I really liked these examples, and partly just maybe my background as a musician before philosophy, but I liked these examples of songwriters talking about their songwriting. And so in the chapter on creativity in my book, Explaining Imagination, I give a number of these long quotes from people like Bob Dylan and Paul Simon and Neil Young, Leonard Cohen, people I think of as really great songwriters. And there's a theme in them all where they talk when they, and I took a bunch of these from a great collection of interviews on songwriting called Songwriters on Songwriting by Paul Zollo. It's great if you're just interested in songwriting, and all these are fantastic long interviews where they really get into the craft, and people in the songwriters are very open about their process and very reflective about it. But one thing you find again and again when they ask, okay, where do the good songs come from? What's your method here? They're very insistent. There is no method. They all like to appeal to, it's the subconscious. These things come, you can't force it. It's these things, you just have to put yourself in a position of kind of receptivity to it. And then somehow, when the ideas come, you let them come. But if you try to sort of control it too much, you lose what the really good, the really inspiring, interesting ideas. Often they're talking about lyrical ideas. So, okay. So there are a few things I sort of pulled out of that, is that here you have the same idea for themselves, that they feel like part of what is really valuable here and the best songs they come up with and the best ideas is that they can't articulate the process by which they came up to it. There's no set of rules they could tell you that say, there's no algorithm they could write to say, just follow this and you too will write, Tangled Up in Blue or whatever. Right? There's nothing like that. Now, having thought about that, and okay, fair enough. It just seems difficult, seems somewhat mysterious, but it reminded me a lot, and I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts on this, of contemporary deep neural networks, in the sense that they can be trained to detect very sophisticated patterns or things, as we all know, like whether it's a face or a type of object or settings involving soccer or whatever it is. They can be trained to do these very sophisticated discriminations, but the nature of these networks and the nature of machine learning is such that no one ever programs into them a specific rule about what to look for, right? They're just fine-tuned over many, many iterations of training and adjustments of the weights among the connections in the network. And so, if the network itself could talk and you ask, well, how are you doing this? How are you discriminating these things? Right? The network wouldn't be able to tell you the rule, even though there is at some level, there's the network, right? It's mechanic, there's a way it can be programmed. But at the same time, it's not anything like the kind of simple, rule following algorithm that we might have thought of. And so, and then particularly when you turn to these generative algorithms, what is it? Generative
adversarial network.
Adversarial networks,
right.
Where, now they're not just discriminating things, but they're using that ability to discriminate things, essentially, oversimplifying a bit, in reverse, to sort of produce likely versions of the kinds of things they've been trained to discriminate. Okay, now we have something more like creating things and not just discriminating things. But they're using this very finely tuned ability to discriminate, or to generate new versions of things, whether it's, as it's been popularly reported, celebrity-like looking people or a likely Van Gogh type of painting or whatever. But again, there's no sort of specific, there's no rule that that could be written down in English, let's say, that it could say like what it's doing or how it's doing it. Right. If you were to ask the network to say, how the heck do you do this? It's nothing that could be expressed in English or in any language like that. So to me, that seems, again, and to draw an analogy back to the songwriters. Well, the songwriters have all been, trained themselves on listening to all the great music that they've enjoyed over the years. Right. And the people who they find to be doing things well. Right. And they've kind of trained their own network for how things, discriminating what's good from what's bad in music. And in a sense, you can see them as running that backwards right. when they try to produce something. But again, there's no particular rule that could be stated in English about how they're going to do that. But they need to somehow rely on all that training to use it sort of in the opposite direction to produce something new. So, I try to draw out. So, then I'm thinking, well, if that kind of creativity, the almost inexpressible kind of creativity is possible in AI, then, I'm optimistic about setting any particular limits on what AI could do, even if we're not there yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that kind of follows along closely with what Carl Polanyi was saying back in the 1950s, that the limits are that we know more than we can tell, and that we can't. How does something learn something that we don't even know how to express? And so that follows real closely with what he was saying there.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. There's kind of a rich vein in philosophy dealing with this problem of embodied cognition and tacit knowledge, and how it is that you arrive at truths that are inarticulable. They're the kinds of things that you can't really express very well. And we all know this all the time, right? If you try to provide somebody with an algorithm for riding a bicycle, it winds up being pretty hard to do. A lot of it, you just have to kind of interact with the system, get feedback from it, and then some sub-process, some sub-module in your mind is able to kind of parse that and feel it out. Then you learn how to balance on the bike. It's an easy thing to say, but so much of the richness of that experience isn't captured in the actual language.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Thinking like riding a bike is something you learn how to do, but for some reason, for thinking, we often think, well, if I arrived at this conclusion, I owe you an explanation of how I got to it. Unlike riding a bike, maybe part of being rational is what you're supposed to sort of tell you the steps by which you arrived at your conclusion, right? And so we develop an ability to try to do that, but I feel like a lot of that is sort of post hoc interpretation. Like, well, I arrived at this conclusion, I believe this, it must be some, now I know this practice that we have of sort of spelling out reasons why I believe this that others will accept as sort of making this a good thing to believe. But the thinking itself, if we sort of crack into how thinking is really happening, I do tend to agree that it's not happening in this kind of code that's going to map cleanly onto the way we sort of describe our thinking in language.
Yeah, doing and describing are very different things. And I really like the distinction you make between transformative creativity and I guess more quotidian creativity. I don't know what the technical term is, but where you're essentially just learning statistical regularities. You're mapping a pattern and extrapolating or adding some noise or interpreting it in a different way. And it's also, pertinent that that's essentially just what a deep neural network or a generative adversarial network does. It just learns these things. And that gets you a lot, right? You really can get pretty far with that. Arguably, I would say maybe further than a human could get. Like I don't know that, even the best, Van Gogh impersonators would be able to do a whole lot better than a really good generative adversarial neural network at creating a plausible Van Gogh painting. And yet, human beings somehow or another are able to transcend that and to go far beyond just combining the elements that are around and seeing entirely new ways of configuring things, or just reformulating the problem such that it's not a problem anymore. And that's the kind of thing that an algorithm can't do. But or none of the current algorithms can do. But I have to think that on some level it's still the same basic process, right? Like I don't believe there's any magic in human cognition. I don't think there's ever a point where you I don't know, use quantum superposition or something to arrive at a completely novel formulation. I think on some level it just has to be something very similar to what's happening in a neural network. Maybe it's more complicated, but neurons are they either fire or they don't. It's got the same kind of binary property. There's a lot more happening in an actual neuron than an artificial one. Of course, we all know that. But I think there's sort of a grand mystery there in how it is that you do something that looks a lot like what a neural network does, and yet out of that comes everything human beings have made. So somewhere in there, we're missing something in our neural networks.
Well, let me ask you about that. So, as you kind of mentioned this example, they give these neural networks lots and lots of Van Gogh paintings, and then it can sort of create a great version of a Van Gogh, but you feel like it's not doing something new. What if we're training, what if this is kind of like, imagine a painter who only ever saw Van Gogh paintings, right? And then we ask him to paint a painting. He's not going to do a whole lot, you might not be much more, sort of free thinking than the algorithm. And one thing I sort of wondered about in the book was like, well, what if we give an algorithm trained on many different great painters, or a particular selection, right? Just like any artist or person has their own sort of particular influences or likes. So we give them that sort of diverse group that they're trained on, and then use that training to generate something, a likely member of it, but that is in some sense combining all these influences. Could that, with certain combinations, take us to something that seems genuinely new? Or,
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. I actually don't know, and I'm not familiar with any work in the literature. So I'm a machine learning engineer, and so I work with algorithms like this, and I've read a lot of the literature. All of the experiments that I'm aware of tend to be thematic. So the example that comes to mind is Emily Copeland. So this was, I always forget the guy's name. I remember the program's name. It's called Emily Copeland, but I don't remember the guy's name that actually put it together. And it's a music training program, and you can train it on, Mozart, or you can train it on Bach, or you can train it on any of these people. And it can generate really plausible sounding music in their styles. I don't know that it's possible just to give it everything and then say, okay, come up with something interesting. That's an empirical question. I mean, somebody is bound to have tried that. I'm inclined to think that if anything worthwhile had come of it, I would have read about it. But I mean, there's thousands and thousands of papers, so I could be totally wrong about that. But my immediate response is, given the algorithms we have today, they're learning a function, an enormously complicated function. They're finding statistical regularities and finding some way of representing that with their internal structure, such that they can generate new examples from that. But I don't know that they're flexible enough to just, take all the Van Gogh you have and all the whoever else you have and then produce something interesting out of that. It's possible, though, that you could do that and produce something that a human would find compelling. So the algorithm can't look at this and say, this is good new art, but we might be able to say, okay, that's Picasso and Van Gogh. 99% of this is weird garbage, but this one right here is actually pretty cool. You could give this to a human, a talented art student, and they might be able to go from there and take it into an interesting place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, you just, it does make sense that, even the great artists, right, they don't pop out of nowhere, right? Everyone talk, well, they're influenced,
right, exactly.
Bob Dylan obviously influenced by Woody Guthrie and others and so on, and painters on down the line. So it and that's often how people are interpreted in terms of their influences, in terms of a combination of things that somehow adds up to something new. So I would definitely leave the door open to that, AI modeling that sort of combination of training on multiple things to come up with something new. But yeah, and without any judgment about whether what it was coming up with was good. But yeah, I get it that is still, it does sound like a different kind of task.
You know what would be an interesting way to approach that would be to train an ensemble of neural networks on different styles and then have something more like a reinforcement learning agent that works with each of them and manages them and then learns how to take the outputs and combine it in interesting ways.
Yeah.
You might be able to do something
so
like
add
that.
a layer of of supervision. Yeah, which is basically your friends saying, actually, that song sucked, man. Try again.
Right, and then it learns how to combine the output. So each of the strands, each of the sub modules is trained on different styles, and that's all it can do. But its output can be combined in novel and interesting ways. And then the RL agent would have to learn from a human what counts as a good song. That's plausible. That's probably a PhD project or several of them, but that might work.
Yeah.
Yeah. The first AI generated music, they fed in all the Beatles music into this machine, and it spit out a new song that they titled "Daddy's Car," and that was the first AI song. Now that raises all kinds of questions naturally, because do the Beatles get a cut of that? I mean, do they get some royalties off of this thing that they heavily influenced? So the intellectual property questions keep coming up to me as we deal with things like this. But if you were to feed in, Michelangelo and Da Vinci and Picasso into this algorithm and spit out paintings, and in general, I would think that you could expect at least maybe 1% of them to be decent, and maybe you could tweak it a little bit and get them up so maybe 2% are okay. Is that, at what point is it a higher percentage of hits than a human would have? And so it becomes kind of a complicated question, and What I'm trying to get at, though, is what differentiates humans from anything a machine can do, and then how do we capitalize on that? How do we establish that as the safe ground for future jobs for people?
The threat, I guess, would be that many people would be out of jobs, but some people would still be making money somehow with these other technologies going, because you're imagining a future where we simply write ourselves out of existence, but by sort of I guess I'm sort of wondering what that could even be if humans are here trying to accomplish their goals in the world. I don't know. Maybe I should, is there a worry that, certain jobs certainly will get replaced.
Right.
But, the standard thing to say is, well, but then, those will just create new jobs that we hadn't yet imagined. And so
so
on. And this will go on. So Thomas, where do you see that? Yeah. Where do you see the...
Yeah, to help you out a little bit on that, we're actually automating tasks out of existence. We're not automating entire jobs out of existence, and it's not us versus them. It's actually us with them. So somebody generally will own the AI, they'll own the robots, and so somebody is leveraging these additional tools to give them additional capabilities, to give them the ability to do something they couldn't before. And so, but it still leaves that question wide open as to if I want to get trained for a new career, where's the safe ground? Something that I know will never get automated out of existence in the future. But I'm not sure that's knowable, and I'm not sure that thinking we know an answer actually gives us a decent answer.
Yeah, I had actually this conversation with my 14-year-old son just today about whether I think we were listening to something about AI came up, and we're having our bathroom renovated right now by some it's an old house and all kinds of weird things are discovered. And there's a whole team of different people coming in, and they've never seen it like this before. Now they got to do this, and they have to have a lot of physical agility and a lot of know-how and figure out what to do in a slightly different situations. I was suggesting that this would be a really, really difficult to automate with AI. I mean, not just like the problem solving, but a huge difficulty is the robotics of it. Getting the kind of flexibility, movements, and coordinating sort of the thinking part with the acting part to pull off something like renovating a bathroom actually seems quite difficult to me. But my son was not at all impressed. He's like, no, robots, they can turn this way and they can do that. It's simple, he thinks they have no future. So, I think I paused on all this because I really have no idea. It would be strange if philosophy professors were, became AI in the future, but I'm just not the type to put that kind of limit on things. I just don't know.
Yeah.
What will be around, and I wouldn't want to be around 20 years after having given advice to someone to say, well, go into this career. I promise this won't be, handled by AI, and then sure enough, it is.
Yeah. One of the gauges is, as long as we have problems, we will always have jobs. Yeah. Not seeing any end to the stream of problems.
Yeah. So, that's probably well put. Yeah.
That's an interesting gauge.
Yeah.
Well, for what it's worth, I tend to come down more on your side, Peter, in that the robotics problem has proven quite a bit more difficult than people thought it would. And I actually tend to think that the jobs that will be automated last will be the ones that involve, building decks and solving physical problems in the real world that are unique and, one-off and that have never been seen before, even if they bear a pretty strong resemblance to some archetype, something you would read in a book or see in a spec. nevertheless, those little details really do matter a lot. And the physicality of it is one of the greater challenges. So it was interesting that, building algorithms that can solve calculus problems or prove theorems, doing things that are sort of at the pinnacle of human knowledge came first. It was building something that could walk up the stairs and ring a bell and walk back down and not fall and just be ridiculous. That took much longer. And I think part of the reason for that is just that human introspection is shallow. And so the original AI researchers believed that it would not take very long to build a human-level artificial intelligence because many of the things that we take for granted in our mental life just sort of appear phenomenologically. I open my eyes and I just see the world, right? But constructing that representation, that visual representation, to say nothing of all the other sensory modalities, is actually very complicated. And getting sensors to do it and actuators to do it, an algorithm that can integrate all of that information and respond intelligently is really difficult. It's actually not so hard to prove the theorems. I mean, that is itself a very hard problem, but it wound up being easier to automate those things than it was to automate breakdancing or something like that. So I think that the blue collar workers are probably safer than people like me who write code for a living.
Yeah, that was my guess. I mean, you see the amazing kind of text generation done by OpenAI's GPT-3
it's
and
amazing.
Things like, okay, this thing can write a pretty convincing, albeit a little silly and shallow version of a New Yorker article, right? It could master that, Okay, so those writers who, have all this, education, or for that matter, let's say a philosophical article, they can definitely write, C papers in college right now. There's no question about it. But, okay, because you're staying in the world of text, you're starting with text, you're starting with words and working with regularities with words. That's really narrowing your sort of realm of what you have to deal with. You think about just regularities of words as opposed to sort of coming in and ripping out the old bathroom and figuring out what the heck's going on and coordinating all this activity in a new setting, which I agree seems to be a task of a different order.
Yeah, one thing I always mention is that the cars that we drive today have actually been in development for 120 years. So it's taken that long to get to things that are this good. And so if you think about all of the devices that you have in your life, it's taken many, many years to get to this level of sophistication in those devices. So if you think about AI might be moving at a faster pace because it's all digital, but it's still going to take many, many years to get refined to the point where it's able to handle the level of details that humans can attend to.
Mm-hmm. Thomas, do you have views on the particular limits since you raised this question?
Yeah, well, I have some thoughts on, all of our equipment wears out. I mean, how many things in your life do you have that's over 10 years old? How many devices do you have that are over 10 years old? Virtually none. I mean, you might have a car that's over 10 years old, maybe a refrigerator and a washing machine. But other than that, most of the things we're throwing out after a couple of years and getting something brand new. So AI wears out too. All of the robots are going to wear out. I mean, all of these new things that we're creating that we're going to hang our hat on are going to wear out. But what level of AI has to get automated, has to get upgraded? I mean, it's like I saw an ad last night for Windows 1.0, and it was just hilarious. And then you think about we're at Windows 11 now, and then you think about all the other things that are constantly being shoved off to the side because they're too old. And that's the way a lot of this is going to be. And that'll take humans to make those calls as to what things are no longer useful.
Yeah, well, that sounds right. I'm looking around my desk kind of sheepishly, and I've got an old tape measure that's been here around for about 15 years, but that's about the oldest device I have here. Yeah.
You might have a red stapler too.
Yeah.
You can tell the demographic we're targeting. We're going to have to update our jokes. we can't keep throwing those out. I mean, I think it'll work for now, but at some point we're going to have to get more hip, Thomas. So, Peter, I want to spend some time now that we've drug you down all these all these pathways. I want to spend some time talking about your actual work. So, within philosophical circles, you've become kind of infamous for the view that we can reduce imagination to other familiar mental states, like beliefs, desires, and judgments. And the prevailing view in philosophy and psychology is that imagination is kind of its own separate thing with these inscrutable processes that aren't well understood. So why don't we outline that controversy a little bit, and then spend some time thinking about how it could apply to an artificial intelligence? Like why would an AI want an imagination, and how might we instill it with one?
Sure. So, starting kind of with the last part of that question, why imagination matters for modeling human minds. Well, look, imagination you can think of, at least most generally, as an ability to detach from the here and now, to think about what could have been but wasn't, or what could yet be but isn't yet, to think about, mere possibilities. And this is a really central part of human thought, and it's not shared terribly widely in the animal kingdom. I mean, some animals may do this to degrees, but many, right, are very much in the present at every moment. And of course, there's downsides to being able to think about the past and the future, but there's also major upsides for the human species in being able to do that. And so when I'm thinking about imagination, most generally, I'm thinking about that and other philosophers as well, that ability to sort of consider mere possibilities, let's say. And so, starting with that, we might want to say, well, how could we build something with an imagination? Because if it doesn't have that, it's really not going to be terribly like a human mind.
Right.
It's got to have that, right? That's one of the things that's really distinctive and important about us. And one thing I've been dissatisfied with in the way people have talked about imagination, both in philosophy and psychology, is that they sort of continue to introduce it as its own sort of irreducible aspect of mind. So I put this at the beginning of my book in terms of the question of how you might write a recipe for something. Because if you want to understand what something is, a good way to explain what it is sort of to give the recipe for it. How would you make this thing? What are its parts, right? And Fred Dresky, a philosopher, had a sort of famous line that, if you want to have a recipe for a cake, one of the ingredients better not be cake. Okay. So, my feeling about people's recipes for imagination in cognitive science is that one of the ingredients is always imagination.
Right.
Okay. And so that if that's one of the ingredients, we don't yet understand what it is. We can't yet write a recipe for how to make something with an imagination until we can understand what imagination is in terms of a recipe for it that doesn't involve imagination itself. So that's what I sort of aim to do. And my ingredients for imagination, you might say, well, what are the ingredients? Are they neural processes? Are they sort of, cognitive states or something? Well, I start on a very sort of what people sometimes call folk psychology, just the ordinary kinds of psychological states we talk about when we talk, ordinary discourse. So in particular, beliefs and desires are big ones, or an intention. Okay, so these are all aspects of mind that, people talk about, philosophers, psychologists, as being really central to what make people go, right? You got your beliefs, you believe this, you desire this, you intend to do this. If we know all these things, we can understand a lot about you and what you're about to do, and so on. And when people have talked about imagination, they say, oh, wait, we need to add this further thing. It's not just beliefs, desires, intentions that people have. Then there's this other thing, the imagination. Okay, and when people make that move, that's like, including cake within your cake recipe to me. So I want to say, well, no, let's think about this. Can we explain what it is to imagine in terms of these other kinds of states, beliefs, desires, and so on? Because the good thing about these other kinds of states, we have the beginnings of an idea of how we might give something, analogs of them, to an artificial intelligence. Like we have at least the beginnings of an idea of how you might give, your computer has something like beliefs in the sense that it has the information it has stored on its hard drive. Like this is the information it has stored. This is what it takes to be the world. We can imagine giving something a camera that does something like seeing and then records what was seen, and that can count as its beliefs about the world. We can give it sort of goals, things to do, right? A purpose, and then that can count as its desires. And even if you think that, okay, well, that's not how things are exactly for humans, we at least, we're up and running. We have the beginnings of an idea of how to model those things. If we could then see how imagination to imagine thing is just to use those kinds of things like beliefs and desires in certain kinds of ways, then we would also be up and running with the project of creating an AI with an imagination. So maybe I can make that a little more concrete with an example of a case where we might say, okay, a person has imagined something. How could this just be using their beliefs and desires? So think about a case of a child pretending to be a lion crawling around on the floor. Okay, and the child goes roar and waves her hand in the air and sort of like a claw, and goes on like this. Okay, we might look at the child and say, oh, that's cute. She's pretending to be a lion, and she's imagining that she's a lion. That's what enables her to do this pretense. And in psychology and philosophy, there's a very close tie. People say, oh, the ability to pretend does rely on the ability to imagine. So we look at the child, we say, okay, she's imagining she's a lion, and that's enabling her to engage in this little pretense. After all, she doesn't really believe she's a lion.
Right.
She is just imagining that she's one. Okay. But if we back up from that and say, okay, what cognitively was required of her to engage in this, what we're calling imagining that I'm a lion? So the standard view is something like, well, she has a mental representation that says I am a lion in her mind. That's at least one of the things. Okay. And I have claws in her mind. And those things need to be kept very separate from her beliefs. Otherwise, she'll be counted as crazy. If you actually believe those things. Yeah. That's not good, Okay, so it's very important, as they say, to keep those imaginings quarantined from your belief. And then we're off to the races having to give an account of this sort of special part of the mind where we keep the things we're only imagining. Whereas I would say, well, actually, the child knows how to play this game of pretending to be a lion. She needs to have the desire to make herself kind of like a lion, okay? And she needs to have some beliefs about typical traits of lions, like they roar, they walk on all fours, they have sharp claws. And then she has those beliefs about what lions are like. She wants to make herself kind of like a lion. She doesn't believe she's a lion. And then she simply draws on those beliefs to make herself kind of like a lion. Okay. That's what it was for her to imagine that she's a lion. There's not a further thing in her mind that she disbelieves that, with like a statement in her mind, I am a lion. She doesn't think she's a lion, really. She doesn't need to think about all the things that would be true if she were a lion, such as that, well, my parents must be lions also, and I must be a really weird looking lion, right? She's not engaging in all that kind of thought, right? She's just up to something far more simple. So that's just one sort of toy example of how, while it's very natural to describe someone as who's pretending to be a lion as having this separate part of the imagination where she has all these representations she doesn't believe, you can alternatively describe it as she's just drawing on her information, her beliefs about what lions are like, and trying to make herself like a lion as part of a game. And then so I look at other contexts, like whether it's counterfactual reasoning about what could have happened but didn't, whether it's engaging with fictions, where all kinds of contexts where people have wanted to say imagination is involved in this. And then I try to say, well, actually, if we look a bit more closely and we don't jump to conclusions, we can see this really as just a sophisticated kind of use of your beliefs of different kinds. And that's a good thing if we can see it that way, because we already have at least the beginnings of an idea of how to give something like beliefs to artificial intelligence. And then it means we already have at least the beginnings of an idea of how to model imagination in an artificial intelligence.
So if all of that is true, and we know how to give an algorithm the rudiments of belief or these other kinds of cognition, judgments and so forth, and if those are the constituent parts of imagination, do you think that might give us a way of bridging the creativity gap that we open the show discussing? So we know that these algorithms can notice statistical regularities. They can kind of project forward from that. Might it be possible to build an imaginative faculty out of these simpler parts and use that to engage in what was the term? Transformative creativity?
Transformative creativity. Yeah, I think that's sort of where I wanted to be taking things in the book. There's this idea. There's nothing wrong with, one way to put it is, there's nothing wrong with trying to understand creativity as a kind of reasoning. In fact, imagination as a kind of reasoning. But because imagination, we say that it's very free, we can imagine whatever we want and so on, and it's creative. There's a typical kind of intuitive resistance to viewing imagining as fundamentally a reasoning process. But I try to break down that resistance, and I think that once we do break it down, then, it's true. Some kinds of imagination don't fit the model of certain kinds of reasoning, right? So not all imagination is going to seem like, if A then B, A therefore B. Like, that's not going to seem a lot like imagining.
Right.
But in some cases, it will. And in other cases, as we get into those cases with creativity, if we think about what generative adversarial networks are doing as a kind of reasoning about, well, hey, this would be a likely member of the things I've been trained on, and
right.
It's a kind of a reasoning process it's carrying out. If you think of that, if we might describe it in that way, it's using its knowledge to generate that sort of new product. But it's also something sort of creative about it, something sort of new, something we can also step back, and depending on the purposes it has for creating it and the context, we might also be correct to describe it as, well, that's what it is to imagine, is to sort of use your best guess to generate a possible member of this set. And, it's also a kind of reasoning, and we don't need to see it as sort of completely distinct from our reasoning faculties, which is sort of the wall that I've been trying to break down.
So as you're talking about this, the thing that's running through my head is this central question of how do we know when we're in danger? Because it seems like such an interesting question, and where danger can come in lots of different forms and shapes and from different angles. I think people would pay dearly to have a device that could tell them at any moment if they're in danger, but I'm not sure how you'd go about doing that.
You mean any kind of, like, all kinds of danger, right? A multi-purpose.
Yeah. It's one thing to determine if the animal that's approaching you is a dangerous animal. It's another thing to get on a computer and know if an email that you're getting is a fraudulent email. And so, if you do this whole wide range of things, knowing when you're in danger is a really complicated task. And yet that's part of what we're tasked with as humans all the time.
So you want like that RoboCop heads-up display that just says threat detected, or situation
right,
nominal, little outlines it in a green square.
That's right. Yeah. It seems like we have lots of little versions of that in our lives, but no general purpose danger detector.
Well, I think you would need lots of different subsystems that are stitched together, and arguably that's what's happening in the human mind as well. My suspicion is that there isn't a general danger detector. There's a bunch of little submodules that say, well, this dog appears aggressive, and then there are other submodules that say this email is worded in such a way that it seems like it's spam. Like, so you're probably going to have to mimic the way it's put together in the human brain somehow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And do a little better. My car sometimes yells at me, "Brake!" It thinks I was about to run into. I'm like, I'm fine. I'm just taking a tight turn. I'm good. But thanks for your concern.
So I definitely want to discuss some of the work you've done on the connection between language and abstract thought, because this also has ramifications for AI and how we build them. So you were recently the lead author on an experimental psychology paper where your team used nonverbal pictorial stimuli to assess whether the language impairments in people affected by let me start over on that. Hold on. What is it? 4812. Okay, I'm just going to start from the top. I definitely want to spend some time discussing your work on the connection between language and abstract thought. So recently you were the lead author on an experimental psychology paper where your team used nonverbal pictorial stimuli to assess whether language impairments in people affected their capacity for abstract thought. So could you discuss how that experiment was set out and what the results were?
Sure. We are interested in this general question of whether language and also inner speech facilitates what you rightly call abstract thought, where abstract thought is something like the ability to think about abstract kinds of things like justice, philosophy, love, being a living being, or being rare. The notion of making a prediction, where all these things are sort of things you wouldn't straightforwardly perceive in the world. So it's unlike, dog, or even though there's something abstract about the notion of a dog, and that many different things count as dog, and you have to sort of understand the connection, right? There's also a further notion of abstractness where we think about these things that we really important that we're able to think about them, but they're not straightforwardly perceivable. And you might think, well, if language ever played a role anywhere, would it be in allowing us to have these kinds of abstract thoughts and think these abstract things? For instance, could you think that something like, the Democrats really need to increase their support with union leaders in the Northeast United States, or they'll never win the next election? Could you have that kind of thought if you didn't have words?
Right.
You just sit and have the thought, or not, right? And so I think, how could you approach, and people approach this kind of question in lots of different ways. And the way we tried to do it was to present pictorial stimuli. So we didn't want to assume, right, or an ability for language in the stimuli. And that's one of the difficulties in studying this, because obviously, if you have language problems, any kind of stimulus that involves words could be difficult for you to handle, even if you didn't have a process with abstract thought itself. Right. So we want to leave open the possibility that someone is very linguistically impaired, but in fact has absolutely perfect abstract thought. They just can't find the words to put it into, right? And so we were dealing with people with aphasia, and particularly a productive aphasia, and they've acquired this through a stroke, typically, and there are different forms of aphasia, but the sort of people we used had excellent comprehension still, but just very impaired ability to produce language. So you might think of them as like having a really terrible tip of the tongue syndrome. And so you might think, okay, well, these people can't generate words for things out loud or even in their head very well. But does that impair their ability to sort of understand abstract relationships between things? And so we tried to investigate this by giving them a task where they would show one picture at the top. So one example is we'd show a picture of, say, a fortune teller with a crystal ball. And then there'd be 4 images below it, and they would need to pick which one goes with the image of the woman in the crystal ball. And in this example, the 4 cases were a fireman, a weather forecaster, a doctor, and I think it was a policeman or something like that. And so the correct answer in this case is a weather forecaster. With the idea, what links the two? Well, it's not that they looked particularly similar, right? The weather forecaster didn't look any more like the woman with the crystal ball than did the policeman or fireman and so on. It's not as though people with crystal balls are commonly found together with, weather forecasters, right? There's this more abstract connection. It's like, okay, well, they're both involved in this thing of predicting, making forecasting. And to show that you understand the link between those two shows that you understand something sort of abstract. And our hypothesis was that, well, if language is involved anywhere, then the more abstract in that kind of sense the trial, the more difficulties you'll have. And so a less abstract trial would be something, well, that just matches a dog with another kind of dog, say, or a bar of soap with a rubber ducky. The two things are found together all the time. Another abstract trial was a plant as the main image, and then the 4 choices were a metal dog, like the metal dog from Monopoly, a living dog, a wooden dog, and a picture of a dog. And then the idea is like, okay, well, what brings the plant and the dog together is that they're living beings, and this is another abstract concept. And so we did find that the people with aphasia were worse overall by a bit, and that's not to be And that's not surprising. Just they have had a stroke and they had mild cognitive impairments as a result. But the interesting result was that the people with aphasia, as the more abstract the trials got, the more pronounced their difficulties were compared to the controls. So the longer they took. And so the best sort of, they did worse, and then also they took much longer the more abstract they got. And so that suggests that they were particularly heavy hit with difficulty when these were more abstract. So that's sort of suggestive, at least, of a role for language. I find this interesting, in the context of AI, because you might think of, can AI get abstract thought? And of course, that's sort of a vague question. I mean, what do we mean by that? What would it for it to have abstract thought? Well, one way to make that precise is, well, could it be trained to solve this kind of task? Right, where it's not latching on to perceptual regularities in the world on these abstract things. So, for instance, the plant and the living dog aren't somehow found together more frequently than the plant and, say, a toy dog, or the woman with the crystal ball isn't sort of found together more frequently with the weather forecaster than with something else, or they don't look more similar, right? So sort of abstracting away from, you have to understand how things can go together, that where they're not sort of associated together in your perceptual experience of the world in any regular way. So that would be one way of saying, like, how would we go about training an AI to solve those kinds of puzzles? Like, I think we could, in puzzles where it's like, well, match the dog with the dog, I think the AI would do great with that, right? We know they can detect dogs, but we can generate trials where what the two things have in common. Another was a $2 bill was the target, and then one of the choices was a white tiger as opposed to like a robin and a cat and a lion. And so the idea is like, okay, the $2 bill for Americans will know is quite rare, as is the white tiger.
See, yeah.
So then these two go together as things that are rare. Okay, so that's another way of grasping an abstract relationship between two things. Again, so our result was that language, the people with the language impairments with aphasia had pronounced difficulties on those ones, the more abstract they got. Even though, it's important also to realize that it's not that they couldn't do it. So it's a complex relationship. It's not suggesting that, well, if you have aphasia, you just can't possibly, you can't produce the words, then you just can't possibly grasp this relationship. No, sometimes they could. So it's more suggestive of a situation where language plays an important supporting role. We lean on it to sort of help us guess or get at different kinds of abstract relationships, even if we might be able to understand it and grasp it without coming up with the word. So it's a complex issue. I wouldn't want to give the impression that somehow it's very clear what the relationship between language and abstract thought is, but we're trying to, gradually get towards a clearer understanding. And so far, there's some evidence of, a kind of supporting role, a scaffolding role, particular for these abstract kinds of categorizations.
So in futurist circles, we've had a lot of discussions about whether people in 2050 will still have a need to read and write. As I watch my grandkids today, most of their learning takes place on YouTube, and the need to actually sit down and read a book is lessened because people can pick up a video and watch it. And so it brings up some real interesting questions and some interesting debates along the way. But that ties in closely with some of the research you were doing there about the immortal nature of reading and writing that we think is paramount to success in the world. Is it going to always be that way?
Well, crucially in your example, language is still involved. So they're still getting linguistic input and linguistic output. So even if it's not a written word, they are still speaking, right? And they can speak to themselves internally, and you can use that as a tool. So if I were looking at the white tiger $2 bill example, even if I could not read a word, but I still could speak. I might just tell myself a little story, just look at it and say, what are the properties of this? Well, $2 bills are kind of rare, so let's just pin that. What are the properties of the other set, the members of the set that I'm looking at? Well, the white tiger is the rarest one, right? You can still use language as a scaffolding, even if you're illiterate. I mean, and people did for thousands of years before the invention of the written word.
Yeah, it brings up a lot of questions about, okay, what do websites look like? What does music sound like? All of these things. How do you solve math problems if you can't write things down? There's lots of pieces to this that we end up debating, and I'm not sure that anybody has clear answers to any of it just yet.
No, that is really interesting. And in the science fiction novel Anathem, there are these monks that they're literate, they read and they write. They have these huge libraries, but they're able to do math proofs with music. They arrange themselves in choral groups, and they're able to manipulate the tones in such a way that it actually produces a proof. And in writing this, the author Neil Stevenson worked with another guy whose name is escaping me, but he actually developed some of the music that you would use for that. He's like, here's how you would derive this formula from simpler antecedent formulas through the vehicle of music. So that's more just a comment. That's just an interesting connection that struck me as Thomas was saying that.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting thought. And, right. On the one hand, as long as you've got some language, it can still play a role in how you're thinking. But, it will be interesting to think about, okay, but what about being a proficient writer as opposed to a proficient speaker? Are there differences in the way you think if you're only good at one versus the other?
Definitely.
Because I do have students coming up and they say in class, like, but is there a video I could watch on this? I find I'm really good at learning in that way. And I just sort of give them this look like, no, you've got to actually read the Hume, like, I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah.
But, maybe that is a thing. I of course, view it with skepticism just because it's different than when I was a boy. But, could you really be learning everything by video that you learn by engaging with the text reading?
I would be very skeptical with philosophy. I think it sort of depends on what it is you're trying to do. So I find that I'm a reasonably good writer and a reasonably good speaker, but the complexity of the thoughts I can get out in writing are just orders of magnitude larger than what I can get out in speaking, because I just can't hold it in my working memory that way. And I think the advantage of writing it down is just that it's essentially an external memory. I can just externalize these thoughts and build them up over time and come to a conclusion that's just not thinkable. Like, you're never going to get the Kantian metaphysics without the written word. There's just no way. There's no way to hold that in your mind and then express it in speech. Like, what, you're just going to recite this, the critique of pure reason, every time somebody has a question about it? No, there's got to be a way to get it all down so that you can load individual parts into your working memory at a time, grapple with those, consolidate them, move on to the next thing. Yeah.
You're saying it can't be boiled down to a TikTok video. I don't know.
Not one anyone wants to watch.
Kant has a really lousy TikTok account. It's like rambling on and no.
It's a 90-minute TikTok. It's the format just doesn't support it. Well, we are coming up to the hour. Unfortunately, this is one of those ones that I feel like we could have just gone on for 2 or 3 hours. Do you have any closing thoughts you want to leave us with?
I didn't have anything prepared as a closing thought. It's fun to think about. When I'm curious. As Futurati, right? This is the Futurati podcast, and thinking about the future. The only thing I would leave with is, how far do you guys think into the future? Because, we spend so much time sort of, thinking 5-10 years into the future. How far is too far to even make it worthwhile to think about the future from
most clients ask for something in the 5 to 10 year event horizon.
Yeah.
But every once in a while we get somebody that wants to push it farther out. As an example, somebody celebrating their 50th anniversary will want to know what the 50 years from now is going to look like for a company. That's that sort of thing. And but that's pretty rare. But there sometimes it's naturally tied into it because you have to start today to make the things that are going to happen 50 years from now. So you shouldn't overlook the possibilities of setting your viewfinder in a far-ranging mode.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I would like to think about 10,000 years from now, but I feel like that might be I think it's not so much thinking about it, like thinking about whether I can think about it.
Right. Exactly. Like what are you doing in thinking about that? Well, effectively, you're just kind of telling a story about what it might be like. There's no real way to derive from today, these conditions, what 10,000 years will look like.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to settle myself into like, do I have a sort of nothing new under the sun sort of view about humanity where like, okay, they'll have some fancy things, but humanity, I will recognize it and I would feel at home in that world, or is that wrong?
I'm not even sure that would be true for 300 years ago. I mean, if you just plot me back 300 years, I suspect rather a lot of it would shock me.
Yeah.
My wife and I took a tour of the city of Segovia, Spain. And in Segovia, they have the aqueducts that were built by the Romans 2,000 years ago. And they're still intact. They're still a centerpiece of the city. They don't work as aqueducts right now, but it started me down the path of asking, okay, what other structures do we have that are over 2,000 years old? Mm-hmm. And what are we building today that's going to be around 2,000 years from now? Mm-hmm. I mean, will the Statue of Liberty still be around? The Mount Rushmore, the big Unity statue in India, will these still be around 2,000 years from now? Mm-hmm. And it raises lots of interesting questions. And why are we building houses that are kind of designed to fall apart in 30 years rather than 2,000?
Mm-hmm.
And so we're wasting a lot of resources building temporary things when we should be thinking much longer term.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, I'm glad I got to air that puzzle at least.
Yeah.
Thank you for hearing it.
Well, fantastic. Thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And we wish you all the best. Your work is really interesting.
Thanks. It was a lot of fun. You guys take care.
Yeah. Thanks for being on the show. Thanks.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation with Peter Langland-Hassan. Don't forget to like the episode and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, and we will see you next time.